In 1929, in Manchester 20, the largest circular ballroom in the world opened on an island 22 miles off the coast of Los Angeles, built with room for 1,500 dancers under a 50-foot ceiling of Tiffany-style glass. No supporting pillar interrupted the floor. No dance hall on the Pacific coast drew bigger touring bands. No ferry in American maritime history carried more passengers than the single steamship that brought people there, a vessel that would later move 800,000 soldiers during a war. Nearly every spring for 3 decades, the Chicago Cubs crossed those 22 miles to train on a replica of their own home field. Today, that steamship has been scrap metal in a Mexican harbor since 2009. Today, the ballroom that once hosted Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller opens for tour groups on a floor built for 1,500 people and rarely holding a few dozen. This is the story of how an island built to be unforgettable became a place most Americans have never heard of. Chapter 1. The Island in the Pacific. 22 miles of open Pacific separate Catalina Island from the mainland, and that distance is the fact from which nearly everything else follows. It is not a wide channel as channels go, but wide enough and rough enough in a Pacific swell that for most of human history it functioned as a wall rather than a bridge. The island's interior rises steep and dry, chaparral and ranch grass over volcanic rock, cut by canyons that discouraged roads long before anyone thought to build them. No town of consequence ever took root inland. What settlement occurred almost entirely at one place, a half-moon of calm water on the island's leeward side, sheltered from the prevailing swell, deep enough for a ship to anchor close to shore. Every human enterprise that would ever succeed on Catalina, trading post, mining camp, army post, resort, was built around that single cove. Its name was Avalon Bay, though the people who used it first called it something else. The Tongva called the island Pimu. They had lived there for thousands of years before any European saw it, fishing its waters and crossing to the mainland in plank canoes built for exactly that 22-mile passage. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sighted the island in 1542 and put ashore, the first recorded European to do so, and for 60 years afterward it appeared on Spanish charts without a settled name. In 1602, the navigator Sebastian Vizcaino renamed it Santa Catalina, after the saint whose feast day fell nearest his arrival. The name outlasted the empire that gave it. Spain would lose California within Vizcaino's descendants' lifetimes. The name on the map did not change with it. For the next 2 centuries, the island drew visitors, not residents. Russian and Aleut hunting parties worked the coastline in the early 1800s, killing sea otters for pelts until the animals were nearly gone from the channel. Sheep ranching followed in a sporadic, unprofitable way. Herds turned loose on the dry hills with no fencing and little supervision. No permanent town existed. No industry had yet found a reason to fight for the place. The island sat 22 miles offshore, visible from the mainland on a clear day, and unclaimed in any way that mattered. Then, in 1863, men found silver. The strike was never large, but it was large enough to draw prospectors across the channel, and large enough to justify, on paper, a 40-acre town site on the island's west end, platted and named Queen City, before a single permanent structure stood on it. For a little over a year, the island had, for the first time, an economic reason to be populated. It did not last. On January 1st, 1864, 83 soldiers of Company C, 4th California Infantry, came ashore at Avalon Bay under orders that had nothing to do with silver. Union commanders feared the island's isolated coves could shelter Confederate privateers preying on Pacific shipping, and the Army moved to deny them the anchorage. Civilians were briefly ordered off the island altogether. The occupation lasted roughly 9 months. When the soldiers withdrew, the silver boom did not survive their departure. The ore had never been rich enough to sustain the town on its own, and Queen City emptied as quickly as it had filled. For more than 2 decades after that, Catalina returned to what it had been before the prospectors arrived: a ranch, a scattering of sheep, a bay that ships passed on their way to somewhere else. 22 miles kept it that way. Distance had protected the island from every rush that swept through California in those years. Gold, cattle, citrus, oil, because distance made every one of them too expensive to bother with. Then, in 1887, a real estate speculator out of Michigan named George Shadow looked at that same 22 miles of water and saw not a wall, but a price nobody had thought to name. He paid $200,000 for the island. Chapter 2: The Speculator's Town. Shadow was a Michigan real estate speculator who had made his living platting raw ground, buying acreage nobody had built on, drawing streets across it in straight, confident lines, and selling the promise of a town before a single structure stood to prove the promise true. He had done this across the Midwest for years, watched swampland become subdivisions on paper long before it became anything in fact, and he came to Catalina in 1887 believing the island required nothing more than the same treatment. Lines on a map, a name, a hotel substantial enough to make the name seem permanent. He had never built a resort. He had never managed a harbor town, a fishing economy, a population that would need water and lumber shipped 22 miles across open sea. None of that troubled him yet. He laid out the streets first, on the flat shelf of land above the harbor where the old sheep ranch had kept its distance from the water. Avenues, blocks, lots numbered, and offered for sale before the grading was finished. The geometry of a city imposed on a place that had never had one. The name came from his sister-in-law, Etta Whitney, who looked at the Crescent Bay and the hills closing around it and called it Avalon, after the island of old legend, a place removed from the ordinary world by water on every side. Shadow kept the name. It suited the sale better than anything he could have invented himself. The building he raised at the water's edge was not a boarding house pressed into hurried service, but an actual hotel. 3 stories, a wide veranda facing the harbor, the island's first constructed to announce that Avalon intended to be a destination and not merely a stop. He called it the Hotel Metropole. Steamers began arriving with tourists rather than sheep shearers. For a short while, the arithmetic of the thing looked plausible. Lots selling, rooms filling, a town rising where a ranch had stood 20 years earlier and nothing much before that. Shadow had bought the island. He had named its town through the one relative who found him the right word. He had built its hotel. What he had not done was pay for any of it in a way that would hold. By the early 1890s, the ledgers told a plainer story than the brochures had. $200,000 owed to the Lick estate. Interest compounding against a town that had sold a great many dreams and not nearly enough land, and a speculator who was discovering, as men after him would discover in turn, each one certain his arithmetic was the arithmetic that would finally work. That platting a paradise on paper cost far less than paying for one in fact. The payments came due. Shadow could not meet them. Within a few years of the purchase he defaulted, and the island reverted whole to the Lick estate, streets, and hotel, and borrowed legend included. Shadow was the first owner to learn this lesson. He would not be the last. Catalina's second act belonged now to men whose fortune had been built not on speculation, but on freight, on the unglamorous business of moving cargo along a coastline rather than selling views of one. In 1891 and 1892, Joseph, William, and Hancock Banning, sons of the shipping magnate Phineas Banning, paid $128,740 for the island their father's steamers had passed 100 times without stopping. What they intended to do with it, and whether freight money would succeed where speculation money had failed, was a question the brothers had not yet answered. Chapter 3. The Bannings' Avalon. The Bannings did not sell views. They sold passage, and they built accordingly. Within a year of the purchase, the brothers had folded the island into their own steamship line out of Los Angeles Harbor, running vessels on a schedule rather than a whim, and had begun the unglamorous work their father would have recognized as the only kind that mattered. Docks reinforced, roads cut through terrain that had, until then, answered only to sheep, and to the men who herded them, the old Hotel Metropole expanded room by room until it could hold the crowds the brothers intended to bring. There was no single gesture in it, no announcement of intent. There was freight moving in one direction and paying customers moving in the other, and by the middle of the 1890s, the two had become the same business. What made that business durable was not the hotel and not the roads, but a smaller idea, almost incidental: boats with glass set into their hulls, floating low and slow over the kelp beds of Avalon Bay, so that passengers could look down into water 40 feet deep and count fish they had no way of naming. It cost little to build and less to explain. Visitors did not need a brochure to understand what they were being shown. Within a few seasons, the glass-bottom boat was not an attraction among several, but the reason a growing share of them had come at all, and it would remain the single fixed point of the island's identity for 100 years after the men who launched it were gone. The Bannings kept building through the 1890s and into the following decade, and what they built was entertainment in the older sense of the word, not the modern one. A bathhouse went up along the beach. A dance pavilion followed, and then a casino. The word borrowed, as it had always properly meant, from the Italian for a small gathering house, a hall for music and company. Nothing wagered inside it. There were no card tables in Avalon's casino, no dice, no house odds. There was an orchestra, and a floor for dancing, and windows facing the bay so that the two entertainments, the natural and the manufactured, sat within sight of each other. The distinction was not lost on the people who came. It was, if anything, part of the appeal. A resort that offered spectacle without the moral undertow that gambling would have attached to it. The reputation traveled. By the 1910s, Avalon was no longer a local curiosity, but a name known well beyond Los Angeles, and the steamers reflected it. At the height of summer, running multiple crossings a day, each one arriving with more passengers than the last had carried. The Banning brothers had done, in 25 years, what chateau speculation never managed. They had made the island a habit. On the night of November 29, 1915, a fire broke out near the Hotel Metropole. It moved through Avalon's wood frame buildings with no resistance worth mentioning, and by morning roughly 2/3 of the town the Bannings had spent a generation assembling was gone. The hotel, the shops, the boardwalk structures, reduced in a single night to a loss the family would count at $2 million. No lives were recorded lost. The buildings were. The fire did not end the Bannings' ownership outright, but it left behind a debt the freight business could not absorb on its own. And the years that followed were a slow accounting of what the family could no longer afford to hold. In February of 1919, controlling interest in the Santa Catalina Island Company passed out of Banning hands, sold for an estimated $3 million to a buyer whose fortune had been built on a product considerably smaller than a steamship line or an island: chewing gum. His name was William Wrigley Jr. Chapter 4. Enter Wrigley. William Wrigley. Jr. did not come from steamships or real estate. He came from soap. Born in Philadelphia in 1861, the son of a soap manufacturer, he left school at 11, worked his father's wagon routes, and arrived in Chicago in 1891 with $32 and a satchel of baking powder to sell. The chewing gum came second, a free premium tossed into every tin of baking powder to sweeten the sale. And within a few years, the premium had outsold the product it was meant to promote. Men buying the powder for the gum, then buying the gum outright. By February of 1919, at 57 years old, that discovery had become a fortune large enough to buy an island, an estimated $3 million, signed over for controlling interest in the Santa Catalina Island Company, for a stretch of Pacific coastline he had previously visited only as a tourist. He was not a shipping man, not a real estate man, but a gum salesman who had decided, on the strength of a premium nobody had asked for, that he now owned a coastline. He did not treat the purchase as something to be left alone. Money went first into utilities the island did not have: a new water system, a new power plant, telephone lines strung across terrain that had gone without them for decades. Money went into a new steamship fleet to replace the aging vessels the Bannings had run into debt. Money went into trees, eucalyptus and pepper and acacia, and flowering shrubs planted by the thousands along roads that had previously offered visitors nothing but dust and chaparral. None of it was ornamental in Wrigley's own accounting. It was infrastructure for a customer who did not exist yet. His stated goal was specific: to turn Catalina from a rich man's yacht anchorage into a resort the American middle class could afford to visit, a ferry ticket standing in for a private berth. He owned the Chicago Cubs as well, and in 1921 the two holdings converged. Wrigley brought the team to Catalina for spring training, housed them in Avalon, and ordered a practice field built to the exact outfield dimensions of Wrigley Field back in Chicago. Not a resemblance, an actual reproduction. The same distances to the same walls. Laid out 1,800 miles from home. The Cubs trained on the island almost every spring from 1921 to 1941. 20 seasons of ball players ran their sprints on grass planted for no reason but to feel familiar. On a diamond built so a fly ball off a Chicago bat would carry exactly as far in California as it had at home. No other team owner had reason to do this. Wrigley did it anyway. In 1924, he commissioned a new flagship. The SS Catalina was built for $1 million, 301 feet of steel launched to replace what remained of the Bannings fleet, and passengers took to calling her the Great White Steamer for the color of her hull. She was built to move people in volume, thousands a crossing, day trippers and honeymooners and families who had never before considered an island a place they could reach on a Saturday. Over the length of her service, she carried more passengers than any single vessel in American maritime history, and when the country went to war in the 1940s, she went with it, refitted as a troop transport and carrying more than 800,000 soldiers and sailors before her work was done. None of that was visible yet in 1924. What was visible was a new ship, a new schedule, and an island rearranging itself around one man's money. The work went on through that winter, utilities and plantings and construction crews pushing past the point where most resort towns would have called the season closed. It was in those same weeks, with the SS Catalina newly in service and Wrigley's ledger still running toward the horizon, that a barge came in off the coast carrying 14 bison. Nothing else built that season was quite so hard to explain. They were there for a film. No one on the island expected them to stay. Chapter 5. What stayed? The bison had come for a camera, not for the island. Zane Grey's The Vanishing American needed a herd thundering across open ground, and Catalina's interior offered exactly that kind of unpeopled distance, hills enough, silence enough, no telephone poles to keep out of frame. 14 animals were driven inland that winter to wait for their scene. held in makeshift corrals while crews waited on weather and light. They grazed under watch. They were filmed, or filming was attempted. In the flat gray light of a coastal January, hooves and dust, standing in for a plane none of them had ever grazed. Then the picture was cut together in a studio 3,000 miles removed from the island, and the buffalo footage did not survive the edit. What survived was the problem of moving them back. A bison bull can weigh close to a ton, cows and calves not far behind, and no one at the studio or on the island particularly wanted to underwrite 14 return passages for animals no longer needed by anyone. Wrigley did the arithmetic the way he did most arithmetic on Catalina, quickly and in favor of keeping rather than shipping. The herd was released into the island's interior canyons and left to do what herds do, which is survive or fail to on their own terms. They survived. Their descendants would go on doing so for a century. An accident of film production turned into a fixture of the landscape, grazing hills that had never held a bison before 1924 and have not been without one since. By 1927, Wrigley had moved from accidents to intentions. At Pebbly Beach on the island's protected eastern shore, he opened Catalina Clay Products, a factory built to turn the island's own red clay into tile. The clay was native, dug from Catalina ground, rather than shipped in the way nearly everything else on the island had to be shipped in, and that fact alone separated the venture from the resort's usual economics of imported lumber, imported labor, imported stone. It was not a novelty for tourists, an actual industry, one that manufactured something the mainland wanted and would pay to have shipped away rather than shipped in. Here, for once, was a business that started with something the island already owned. The tile trade in Southern California in those years ran on color, and Catalina's kilns learned to compete on exactly that ground. By the early 1930s, the factory employed ceramicists skilled enough to develop glazes distinct to the place. Catalina blue, saturated and cold as the channel water it was named for. Toyon red, pulled from the native shrub that colored the island's hillsides each winter. Descanso green, softer, almost botanical. Roofs and courtyards and fountain basins across the mainland began carrying those three colors. Tile stamped with an island's name on the underside, where no buyer would ever see it. The factory did not make Wrigley rich the way the steamship line had, or the cigarettes. It did something more useful to Catalina in the years just ahead than getting rich. The years just ahead were 1930, then 1931, then 1932. Banks failing on the mainland in numbers large enough that newspapers stopped counting them individually and started counting them in aggregate. Catalina was not exempt from any of it. Tourism thinned, budgets tightened. Plans that had once seemed inevitable were quietly shelved. But a factory running full kilns at Pebbly Beach kept paychecks moving through the island's economy at a moment when paychecks elsewhere had simply stopped, and workers who might otherwise have left for the mainland stayed instead, tile in one hand and rent in the other. It was not salvation. It was payroll, steady where little else was, and on an island that size, the difference mattered more than it would have almost anywhere on the continent. Wrigley was not finished building. Whatever the clay factory represented in patience and modest calculation, the structure he was already raising by the spring of 1929 represented in scale, ambition, and sheer nerve. It would open on May 29th of that year. Nothing else built on the island before that date or after it would be built quite like it. Chapter 6. The Casino. On May 29, 1929, the doors opened, and the island had never seen anything built quite like it, nor would it again. The scale, the ambition, and the nerve promised the previous spring arrived exactly as advertised. The Catalina Casino rose in a circle at the edge of Avalon's harbor, a drum of white stucco and red tile, Mediterranean revival lines, dressed in the geometric confidence of Art Deco, as though 2 decades of architectural fashion had agreed for once not to argue. Sumner Spaulding and Walter Weber had drawn it. Wrigley had paid for it. $2 million. A figure that made the clay works down the shoreline look like exactly what it had been, a rehearsal. Despite its name, there was no gambling inside it, no cards, no wheel. Only the older sense of the word. A house for gathering, for pleasure, asking nothing of a visitor beyond the price of a ticket. Inside, the building solved what other architects of the period had not. A ballroom 20,000 square feet wide, circular, unbroken by a single interior pillar, its ceiling arching 50 feet overhead. It was, by the standards of the time, the largest circular ballroom on Earth built without one, a floor wide enough for a packed house to move without ever stepping around a column, lit from above by chandeliers cut in the Tiffany style. Below it, the casino housed a second first, the earliest theater in the world designed from its blueprints forward to project sound, not a silent era hall rewired after the fact, but a structure built for the talking picture before the talking picture had fully proven itself. Wrigley had wagered twice under one roof, once on architecture and once on technology. Both wagers held. Through the 1930s and into the next decade, the ballroom floor belonged in turn to whichever band was that year the best in the country. Sooner or later, nearly all of them played there. Benny Goodman brought his clarinet and the crowds that followed it. Glenn Miller brought arrangements that would outlast him. Artie Shaw came, Harry James came, and the Count Basie Orchestra came up from Kansas City by way of everywhere else. Each one taking its turn on a floor, built to hold more dancers than any ballroom on the coast could offer under a single unbroken roof. Avalon, for 1 week or 1 weekend at a time, became the best attended ballroom in the country and one of the least accessible, reachable only by boat. A radio line carried the sound out from the bandstand across the channel into receivers and households that would never see the chandeliers or the water beyond them. A Saturday night in Avalon became, for a few hours, a Saturday night audible in Ohio, in Illinois, in states that had never had an island. Picture a Saturday night in 1937, the floor filled deep with dancers. Benny Goodman's band is arranged across the stage under the 50-foot ceiling, and the Tiffany chandeliers throw broken color down onto a floor with nothing beneath it to interrupt a couple's turn mid-step. The clarinet carries over the horns carry over the rhythm section, and none of it needs a beam to hold it up, because the entire premise of the room was that nothing should stand between the music and the water outside the windows. Radio microphones catch the set and send it out across the channel. Somewhere in Ohio, a family sits by a receiver and hears, without quite knowing where the sound is coming from, the particular echo a circular room makes when a packed floor moves at once. Outside, the harbor sits dark, except for the boats still bringing the last of the crowd in from the mainland. Inside, under the chandeliers, the light does not flicker and the band does not stop. And the floor does exactly what it was built to do. No one dancing that night has any reason to wonder what the same floor would do on some other Saturday under a different kind of weight. The trouble, when it reached Catalina clay products, arrived quietly, and it arrived the same year. The Depression had taken 8 years to find the pottery works, coming not as a single collapse, but as a slow arithmetic. Production costs climbing on an island where everything had to be shipped in, cheaper clay bodies arriving from mainland competitors who carried none of Catalina's freight costs. By 1937, the numbers no longer worked, and the company sold the equipment, the molds, and the trademark to Gladding, McBean and Company, a mainland firm with none of the island's romance and all of its economics. Catalina's own manufacturing industry, begun in Patience less than a decade earlier, ended in a transaction that occupied no more of the island's attention than a shipping schedule. No one wrote it into that Saturday's radio broadcast. The tile that had covered rooftops across Southern California simply stopped being made where it had started. For 4 more years, the pattern held, bands arriving, radio carrying them out across the channel, the pottery's absence barely registering against the noise of everything else still working. Then, on December 23, 1941, 16 days after Pearl Harbor, Avalon received an order that had nothing to do with music at all. Chapter 7. The Quiet Retreat. The paperwork that reached Avalon on December 23, 1941, read like routine. A notice, filed and forwarded. No different in tone from 100 others crossing a wartime desk that week. 16 days after Pearl Harbor, the United States government closed Catalina Island to the public. Not a restriction, not a curfew, an actual closure. Total and indefinite, sealing off the harbor, the beaches, and the ballroom floor to anyone without a uniform. For 4 years, from 1942 through 1945, no ferry brought a tourist across the channel. No band played to a paying crowd. No family stepped off a gangway to check into a hotel that had, for 2 decades, existed for no other reason than to receive them. In its place came the war, parceled out across the island in 4 unconnected postings: the U.S. Maritime Service training merchant mariners in Avalon, the Coast Guard drilling recruits at the Isthmus, the Army running a radar station in the interior, and the Office of Strategic Services teaching operatives silent combat and demolitions at Toyon Bay. None of it required an audience. None of it left a receipt at a souvenir counter. The numbers behind the closure were simple enough to state without embellishment. Avalon's economy ran on visitors, on hotel beds filled, on ballroom tickets sold, on glass-bottom boat fares, and the small transactions of a town built to receive strangers by the boatload. For 4 consecutive years, there were none. Not fewer visitors, not a slow season stretched long. None. A resort island, its entire commercial structure built around people who did not come, for 48 straight months, while the buildings meant to hold them stood occupied instead by soldiers and sailors who paid nothing to be there. What survived did so on military contracts, or did not survive at all. Peace did not restore the town at once, but it restored the shape of things. Spring training resumed in 1946, the Cubs returning to the practice field they had used since 1921. Tween, the crowds returning with them in smaller but familiar numbers. It held for 5 seasons. After 1951, the team quietly stopped coming. The cost of shipping a major league roster 22 miles by boat, defensible in an era when Catalina was still a novelty worth the trouble, no longer made sense against post-war travel and post-war economics, and no formal announcement marked the end of it. The field went back to being what it had been before William Wrigley Jr. ever arrived, a park. The ballroom's decline followed the same quiet arithmetic. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, as the national big band era wound down city by city, the roster of orchestras willing to cross the channel thinned with it. The touring headliners replaced, year by year, by smaller acts, then by local ensembles, then by whatever the tourist calendar could still support. The room built to hold a crowd of that size, under a Wrigley chandelier, kept its floor. It simply stopped filling it the way it once had. 2 unrelated decisions converged on the same year. On February 14, 1975, the Wrigley and Offield families deeded 42,135 acres, roughly 88% of the island, to the newly formed Santa Catalina Island Conservancy, a gift that permanently protected the interior from the kind of development that had reshaped 100 other coastal towns. It was a conservation triumph and, at the same time, a ceiling. An island that could never sprawl the way a mainland resort could, its growth capped by its own preservation. That same year, the steamship that had carried a generation of dancers across the channel made her final passenger crossing. The SS Catalina had run that crossing since 1924, and by the early 1970s, smaller, faster boats had already begun taking her business away one trip at a time. She was retired from passenger service in 1975, 51 years after her first voyage, and the grand approach by steamship, the thing that had made arriving in Avalon feel like an event rather than a commute, ended with her. What happened next belonged to no one connected to the island's original design. In 1977, she sold at auction for $70,000 and spent a brief run as a floating discotheque before that venture failed too. By 1997, she had run aground in a harbor in Ensenada, Mexico, and sat there half submerged, rusting in shallow water, waiting for a fate that would not be decided for another 12 years. Chapter 8. What Remains? The 12 years ended in 2009. No salvage crew came for her, no museum, no last owner with a plan. Workers in Ensenada cut the SS Catalina apart where she sat, half submerged in the harbor, and sold her in pieces as scrap metal. The ship that had carried more passengers than any vessel in American history, that had brought 1 million visitors a year across the channel at her peak, went out of existence a few tons at a time, unwatched by anyone from the island she had served for 51 years. Nobody in Avalon came to see it. There was nothing left to see. The island kept burning through its own weather in the years that followed. In May 2007, a wildfire moved through more than 4,000 acres of Catalina's interior, and ash began falling on Avalon streets before the town understood how close the fire had come. Roughly 3,800 residents were evacuated by ferry. The same channel crossing that had once carried honeymooners and big band crowds now carrying families off the island with what they could grab. About 1,200 homes sat under evacuation orders. The fire did not reach the casino or the business district. It reached close enough that the town spent days not knowing that in advance. Water proved the harder problem and the slower one. By August 2014, a statewide drought had pulled the Middle Ranch Reservoir down to nearly a quarter of its capacity, and Avalon moved to Stage 2 rationing, a mandated 25% cut for every household and business on the island. The town had already built the first municipal desalination plant on the West Coast back in 1992, an admission, even then, that an island depends on machinery for the thing a mainland town takes from the ground. In 2016, it built a second plant. The reservoir was not enough on its own anymore, and had not been for some time. The numbers today describe a place still losing residents rather than gaining them. Avalon's permanent population has fallen to roughly 3,193, down about 7% since the 2020 census. Housing costs run close to 200% above the national average, and people who have lived on the island for decades describe waiting years for a year-round rental to open up. In October 2024 alone, visitor arrivals dropped nearly 17% from the year before. A resort economy built on 100 years of ferries, casinos, and postcards now runs on thinner margins than the men who built it ever priced in. Some things outlasted all of it. The bison brought over for a film shoot in 1924. 14 animals, never collected, never written into any contract that survived, still graze the island's interior. Their numbers are kept in check now through contraception rather than removal, a quieter form of the same management decision made a century ago by men who are no longer remembered for making it. The herd does not know whose movie it was for. It has outlived the studio, the ranch hands, and the reason it was ever there. The Catalina Casino still stands over Avalon Bay. Its 50-foot ceiling holds, its Tiffany-style chandeliers hang where they were installed, and the building takes tour groups and the occasional private event on a schedule that would have seemed impossible to the men who opened it in 1929. The dance floor was built for 1,500 people moving across it at once. It rarely holds more than a few dozen now. Tour groups mostly. Cameras out, footsteps carrying across the room, the way sound carries in a space built for a use it no longer has. The light comes in low off the water in the late afternoon and lies across that floor in long bars, catching the same chandeliers, empty or full, the same as it did in 1929. The building was built for a crowd. What it holds now is quiet,